The dust had barely settled. The Greeks were still wiping the blood off their shields, slapping each other on the backs, filling the Mesopotamian air with laughter and the low, reverberating thud of spear butts knocked against the dry earth in triumph. They had done what they were paid to do. They had smashed through the left wing of the great king's army like a bronze fist through wet clay. The royal left had broken and fled. The enemy before them had scattered like birds before a thunderclap. By every measure that any soldier on that flat, god-forsaken plain could see, the Greeks had won. Clearchus of Sparta, a man who had never, not once in his entire life, retreated from anything, walked the lines. He was a broad-shouldered, iron-souled creature of pure war. He nodded. He surveyed the rout ahead of them, and somewhere in his chest, the mechanical ticker he used in place of a human heart probably allowed itself a single beat of satisfaction. Then a rider came, not from the enemy, from their own side, and the message he carried turned that Spartan calm to ice. Cyrus was dead. Not wounded, not captured. Dead. Killed in a furious, almost insane personal charge directly at his own brother's bodyguard in the centre of the battlefield, surrounded by thousands of men, far from the Greeks who could have protected him. The man who had recruited them, who had promised them gold and glory, who had marched them nearly 1,500 miles from the Aegean coast through the beating heart of Persia. That man was already a cooling corpse somewhere in the dust of Cunaxa. Personally, I always think about what that moment must have felt like. I think about Clearchus standing there, this utter hard case who had survived wars, exile and political ruin, and suddenly realizing, mid-victory, that they had won nothing, that they were 10,000 Greek soldiers standing in the middle of the Persian Empire, more than 1,000 miles from the sea, without a patron, without a paymaster, and without a plan, surrounded on all sides by an enemy who had just watched their own king survive. They had won their battle and walked straight into hell. But to understand how 10,000 of the finest warriors the ancient world had ever produced ended up stranded in the Mesopotamian desert with nowhere to go and no one to lead them home, you have to go back. Back past the battle, back past the march, back past the recruiting of mercenaries and the quiet forging of conspiracies. You have to go back to a deathbed in Babylon, to a court full of poisoned ambitions and a mother's catastrophic, all-consuming love for her favourite son. You have to go back to the moment one prince decided he wanted what his brother had been given. Everything. It is 404 BC, and the man who holds the world is dying. Darius II, king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, master of a domain that stretches from the Aegean coast all the way to the borders of India, is fading in his palace at Babylon. He has been king since 423 BC, having clawed his way to the throne through a brutal succession crisis of his own, deposing and murdering rivals in the standard Persian fashion. Now, after 2 decades of rule, he's leaving behind an empire that is still, despite everything, the largest and most powerful political entity on the face of the earth, and he's leaving behind sons. That last part is where the trouble starts. Darius and his formidable queen, Parysatis, had 4 sons who survived to adulthood: Artaxerxes the eldest, then Cyrus, then Ostanes, and finally Oxythres. The eldest son, Artaxerxes, was the obvious legitimate heir. Everyone at court knew it. He was older. He had been groomed for kingship. Under Persian law and Achaemenid tradition, primogeniture was not rigidly enforced the way it was in some Western kingdoms, but in practice, the eldest surviving royal son carried enormous weight. Artaxerxes, who would take the throne name Artaxerxes II and come to be known to history as Artaxerxes Mnemosyne, the Rememberer, was going to be king. But Parysatis did not love Artaxerxes. She loved Cyrus. You cannot understand this story, and not the rebellion, not the battle, not the betrayal, not any of it, without first understanding Parysatis. She was not a passive ornament of the Persian court. She was, by every ancient account we have, one of the most politically active, ruthlessly intelligent, and genuinely terrifying women of the ancient world. In the Greek tradition, most of it filtered through Ctesias, the physician who served at the Persian court from 404 to roughly 397 BC. Parysatis appears as a woman with a network of spies, informants, and agents that reached into every corner of the empire. She played board games with the king for the lives of human beings. She won and she collected. And her favourite son, her clearly, unambiguously preferred child, was Cyrus. Why Cyrus over Artaxerxes? The ancient sources don't give us a clean psychological answer, but the shape of the relationship suggests itself. Artaxerxes was cautious, diplomatic, patient. He was, by the standards of Persian kingship, something close to reasonable. Cyrus was a force of nature. He was bold, decisive, physically courageous, and magnetically charismatic in a way that made soldiers follow him not out of duty but out of something closer to love. He was also born after his father had become king, which by some Persian court interpretations made him more royal by birth than his older brother. It was a flimsy argument, and everyone knew it. But Parysatis used it anyway, loudly and repeatedly in the final days of Darius's life. She failed. Darius died in 404 BC, Artaxerxes took the throne. The new king barely had his crown when the family nearly tore itself apart. During the coronation ceremonies at Pasargadae, the ancient spiritual capital of the Persian Empire, and the sacred site where the kings of Persia were confirmed in their power by the priests of the old religion, Tissaphernes, a powerful Persian nobleman and satrap of Caria, recently displaced from Lydia by Cyrus himself, made an accusation. He went to Artaxerxes II and told him, bluntly, that his younger brother Cyrus was plotting to assassinate him right there during the ceremony. According to Plutarch's Life of Artaxerxes, which draws heavily on Ctesias's eyewitness account, Artaxerxes arrested Cyrus on the spot. Parysatis saved his life. She interceded personally, furiously, and with the kind of force that only a woman with 20 years of political capital behind her could muster. She persuaded Artaxerxes to release Cyrus and send him back to his satrapy in western Anatolia rather than execute him. It was a decision the great king would spend the rest of his life regretting, because Cyrus went back to Sardis, and he started planning. Sardis was the capital of the satrapy of Lydia, a rich cosmopolitan city at the western edge of the Persian world, sitting at the point where the Persian Empire touched the Greek-speaking Aegean coast. It was the perfect place to build a conspiracy, close to the Greek city-states, whose mercenary soldiers were the finest infantry on earth. Far enough from the royal court at Susa and Babylon that a man could do things without the king's eyes seeing them immediately. And Cyrus, who was still only in his early 20s at this point, had something even more valuable than geography. He had a reputation among the Greeks. Since around 408 or 407 BC, he had held supreme command in Asia Minor. He had worked closely with the Spartans during the final years of the Peloponnesian War, supplying them with the gold and naval resources that allowed Lysander to crush the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BC and bring the long war to an end. The Spartans, characteristically, had been perfectly happy to take his money. But more than that, individual Greek soldiers, commanders, mercenary captains, men who had spent their careers selling their spears to whoever would pay, had come to know Cyrus personally. They respected him. Some of them genuinely liked him. He paid on time, which in the mercenary world is not a small virtue. It was into this web of personal relationships and military familiarity that Cyrus now began to quietly drop his hooks. The recruitment was conducted necessarily through deception. Cyrus could not announce that he was raising an army to overthrow the King of Kings, not openly. So the Greek mercenaries who were contacted, through intermediaries, through trusted officers, through the quiet networks of men who make a living with a spear, were told varying cover stories. Some were told they were being hired to fight the Pisidians, a troublesome mountain people in southern Anatolia whose raids had long been a nuisance. Others were given even vaguer assurances about the prince's needs in the east. The precise deception varied depending on who was being recruited and how much Cyrus judged they needed to know. Clearchus of Sparta knew more than most. He had to. He was too important to the operation for Cyrus to keep him entirely in the dark. Clearchus was approximately 50 years old, in 401 BC, born around 450 BC, and he was the kind of man that the Spartan agoge, the brutal lifelong military conditioning system, produced at its most extreme. Xenophon, who knew him personally and wrote about him with a clarity that stops short of admiration, described him as a man who was, in the Greek phrase, polemikos kai philopolemos eskatos, warlike and loving war to the utmost degree. Not a man who was good at war, a man who needed it, the way other men need food or air. Without war, without the structure of command and the daily grind of military life, Xenophon implies Clearchus was almost non-functional. His career before Cunaxa tells you everything. He had been sent to govern Byzantium in 411 BC by the Spartan government, and he had been, by most accounts, a spectacularly harsh administrator. He made himself so unpopular that Alcibiades, the Athenian general, was able to take the city from him in 408 BC in part because the locals were willing to open the gates. He went back later, made himself something close to a tyrant, and was eventually forced out by the Spartan authorities themselves, declared an outlaw by the very state he had served his whole life. He fled in the early 400s BC to Cyrus. Honestly, when you think about it, Clearchus and Cyrus were almost made for each other. One was a prince without a throne, the other was a general without a command. What Cyrus was offering was not just employment, it was the chance for both of them to finally get what they believed they deserved. The force that assembled at Sardis in the spring of 401 BC was not a raiding party. It was an army, Xenophon's account, and the broader ancient evidence suggests a total Greek mercenary force that numbered somewhere in the region of 10,000 to 13,000 heavy infantry, the hoplites, the armoured spearmen who formed the beating heart of any Greek military operation, supported by lighter troops, cavalry contributions from Cyrus's Persian and allied forces, and a substantial baggage train. The Greek contingent was organised into several commands. Clearchus led the Peloponnesian troops, the Spartans and their allies, and commanded the right wing, which was the most prestigious position in a Greek army. Other commanders included Proxenus of Boeotia, who had recruited soldiers from central Greece and who had brought along, as a private observer with no official command, a young Athenian gentleman scholar named Xenophon. That name, Xenophon, will matter enormously before this story is done. The army marched, south, then east, then south again, following the route of the Euphrates River deeper and deeper into the heart of the empire. And as the miles accumulated, Sardis, Iconium, Tarsus, Thapsacus, city after city, the soldiers began to do the math that soldiers always do. They looked at the distance they had already covered. They looked at the direction they were still going. They looked at each other. At Tarsus in Cilicia, the Greek contingent mutinied, or something close to it. They refused to march further because by now everyone could see that this was not a campaign against the Pisidians. Nobody goes to Babylonia to fight mountain brigands in southern Turkey. The men confronted their commanders. Clearchus, characteristically, handled the situation through a combination of theatrical loyalty to his troops, publicly weeping and declaring he would go wherever his men went, and a blunt, honest appeal to greed. Cyrus increased their pay. He promised bonuses at the end of the campaign. He still did not tell them, explicitly, that they were marching to overthrow the king of Persia. But everyone knew. By Tarsus, everyone knew, and they kept marching anyway. Because 10,000 Greeks in the ancient world believed they could beat anything. They had beaten the Persians at Marathon. They had beaten them at Plataea. They had turned Thermopylae into legend. The idea that a Persian army, however vast, could defeat a Greek phalanx in open battle was to these men genuinely difficult to take seriously. That confidence was not entirely wrong. It was their complete and total misunderstanding of everything that would happen after the battle that was going to kill them. There is a particular kind of madness that sets in when an army has been walking for weeks and the horizon never changes. The sun rises on the same flat burning earth. It sets on the same flat burning earth. The dust coats everything, your teeth, your eyelids, the cracked leather of your sandal straps, the inside of the bronze bowl of your helmet. You stop noticing individual days. You start measuring time in how worn your feet are, how empty your water skin has become, how much the man in front of you is starting to smell. That is the world the 10,000 entered when they marched east from Sardis in the spring of 401 BC, and they kept marching into it for months. The route Cyrus chose was not the shortest path to Babylon. It was the path that allowed him to maintain the fiction of his stated purpose for as long as possible, gathering forces, testing loyalties, and watching the political weather all the way down from the Aegean coast through the mountains and plains of Anatolia. From Sardis, the army moved east through Lydia and Phrygia, through Iconium, which Xenophon places at the last city of Phrygia, then across Lycaonia and Cappadocia before descending south through the Cilician Gates, the dramatic mountain pass that cuts through the Taurus range and drops you down onto the Cilician plain toward the sea. It was at Tarsus, the great coastal city of Cilicia, sitting warm and prosperous at the mouth of a river, that the first serious crisis of the march exploded. The soldiers had already been doing the math for weeks. You cannot walk 1,000 miles east by southeast toward Babylon and pretend you're going to fight hill tribes in southern Turkey. The Greeks were not stupid men, they were professional soldiers, which meant they had survived long enough to develop very good instincts about when they were being lied to. At Tarsus, those instincts finally turned into open refusal. The men sat down. They would not march another step further east. There was shouting. There were accusations levelled at the junior commanders. There was the ugly, formless energy of a military force on the edge of disintegration. 10,000 armed men with no agreed-upon direction, which is one of the most genuinely dangerous things that can exist in the ancient world. This is where Clearchus of Sparta earned whatever the ancient world paid in professional reputation. Here is the thing you need to understand about Clearchus. He was not a beloved commander. Not warm, not charismatic, not the kind of general who made you feel he cared whether you lived or died. Xenophon was direct about this. Clearchus was a man who chose war the way other men choose mistresses, compulsively, extravagantly, to the ruin of everything else. His punishments were immediate, his patience for excuses was zero. But none of that mattered when things went wrong. When the danger was real and the situation impossible, the soldiers who had been itching to desert him suddenly wanted no one else. That iron face never cracked, not once. The calmness that came off him in a crisis was not the calmness of a man who did not feel fear. It was the calmness of a man who had made a permanent decision about how he was going to live, and fear had no leverage against that. When everything was falling apart, that quality was worth more than 1,000 warm speeches. At Tarsus, he played the mutiny with a kind of calculated cynicism that was almost theatrical. He stood before the men and, in what Xenophon records as a genuinely extraordinary performance, declared that he himself refused to march any further into Asia against the king of Persia without the soldiers' consent. He claimed to stand with them. He made a show of weeping, and the ancient sources leave it genuinely ambiguous whether those tears were real, at the thought of abandoning Cyrus after the prince had trusted him. He then proceeded to work the crowd with the patience of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, until the tide of opinion began, slowly, to shift. Simultaneously, Cyrus increased the men's pay. He raised it by 50%, from 1 daric a month to 1.5 darics. He sweetened the promise of a bonus to be paid at the campaign's end. He still did not tell them, explicitly, that their destination was the throne of Persia. But by the time the army packed up and resumed its march east from Tarsus, everyone understood the deal. The pretense was gone, and the men had decided, consciously, to go anyway. That decision deserves a moment of genuine thought. These men were not coerced at sword point. They chose to march further into one of the most powerful empires in human history, knowing that they were part of a rebellion against its king, because the money was good, and because they genuinely believed, based on every military experience the Greek world had accumulated over the previous century, that a Persian army could not beat them in the field. That confidence was not arrogance without basis. It was a rational assessment built from Marathon, from Plataea, from the long-grinding wars of the Ionian Revolt and the Peloponnesian period, in which Greek hoplites had again and again demonstrated a tactical superiority over Persian infantry that seemed almost structural, built into the physics of how these two kinds of armies were designed to fight. The Greek phalanx, heavy infantry in tight formation, overlapping shields, coordinated thrusting spears, was a weapon system optimized for head-on collision. The Persian infantry, for all its vast numbers, was simply not built to absorb that kind of shock and keep standing. The Greeks were right about that part. They would prove it at Cunaxa beyond any possible doubt. They just had absolutely no plan for what came afterward. From Tarsus, the army descended through the Syrian gates, another mountain pass, this one cutting through the Amanus range, and into the flat, sun-hammered country of northern Syria, then south along the Euphrates. The river was already starting to define the world. On one side, the organized, irrigated civilization of Mesopotamia, the oldest continuously inhabited agricultural landscape on Earth, crisscrossed with canals, dotted with villages, rich with the slow accumulated wealth of thousands of years of human settlement. On the other side, the desert. The army moved along the seam between these two worlds, and the deeper they pushed, the more the landscape pressed down on them with its sheer indifference to human suffering. The heat in Mesopotamia in the late summer is not merely hot, it is heavy. It presses on you from above and radiates back up at you from the ground, and gets inside the metal of your equipment so that your armour becomes a cooking vessel and you are the thing being cooked. The Greeks were not acclimatized to this. Many of them came from the Peloponnese or central Greece or the islands, climates that could be harsh in their own ways, but nothing like the flat, windless, merciless furnace of the Mesopotamian plain in August. Men fell sick. Feet blistered and cracked. The water sources they depended on were variable. Sometimes the managed irrigation canals of Mesopotamian farming communities, sometimes scarce wells that the local population did not always feel generous about sharing with a column of 10,000 armed foreigners passing through their lives. And through all of it, Clearchus maintained order. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the march, because keeping 10,000 professional soldiers, men with weapons and grievances and limited futures and nothing particularly to lose, coherent and functional over thousands of miles through hostile and alien territory, is genuinely one of the most difficult things a human being can be asked to do. Clearchus did it through a combination of absolute clarity about expectations, immediate and disproportionate punishment for violations, and a logistical competence that Xenophon specifically praises. The man actually knew how to feed an army in the field, how to find supplies, how to ensure the machinery of the column kept turning even when the terrain and the people and the weather were actively trying to stop it. He also did it through something more subtle, which was the management of information. The soldiers knew they were marching toward Babylon, toward a confrontation with the king of Persia, toward something enormous and possibly fatal. Clearchus did not pretend otherwise, but he controlled the pace at which they thought about it. He kept them busy, kept them marching, kept the days full of the small grinding necessities of military life, foraging, camp construction, sentry duty, the endless physical maintenance of their equipment, so that the existential terror of their situation never quite had enough quiet to crystallize into panic. It almost failed at the Euphrates crossing. At Thapsacus, the point where the army crossed the Euphrates River on its way into the final stretch toward Babylon, Cyrus finally told them the truth. He stood before the assembled Greek commanders, according to Xenophon's account, and acknowledged that the march was directed against his brother Artaxerxes II, the reigning king of Persia. Not against Pisidian hill tribes, not against some regional satrap. The king himself in his full strength, with all the military resources of the largest empire on earth behind him. There was a moment of genuine shock, or at least the performance of genuine shock among some of the commanders. There were demands for additional pay. There were negotiations. In the end, Cyrus promised each soldier an extra bonus of 5 minas of silver upon arrival in Babylon, a substantial sum, and the army agreed again to continue. Personally, I find this moment one of the most psychologically fascinating in the entire story. These men had known for weeks, and yet the formal acknowledgement of what they were doing produced a genuine reaction, as if the spoken word gave a reality to the thing that the unspoken knowledge had not quite carried. There is something profoundly human in that, the difference between knowing something and having it said out loud. Once Cyrus said it, it was real, and they had still chosen to go. Beyond Thapsacus, the landscape changed. The organised agricultural zones of northern Syria gave way to a wider, emptier country as the army pushed south and east along the eastern bank of the Euphrates. There were no more cities to impress or negotiate with. There were villages, local communities whose relationship with the marching column was entirely defined by the column's need for food and water. There was desert to the south and west, and the river, always the river, brown and wide and carrying the snowmelt of distant mountains toward the Persian Gulf, the one fixed reference point in a landscape that was otherwise almost impossible to navigate with confidence. The army was now receiving intelligence through scouts and through local informants who could be bribed or intimidated into talking that Artaxerxes knew they were coming. This was, of course, inevitable. A force of 10,000 Greeks accompanied by tens of thousands of Persian and allied troops and a massive baggage train does not move silently through the countryside. The great king had been watching, through his own network of satraps and scouts and post-road riders, from at least as far back as the Euphrates crossing. His commanders had been considering where and how to stop the rebels. There was even a report that the Persians had considered digging a defensive ditch across the plain, a massive earthwork obstacle stretching from the Euphrates to the Median Wall that would have forced Cyrus to fight from a disadvantageous position. That project was apparently abandoned, either because it was too large or because Artaxerxes' generals were confident they could defeat the rebels in open battle. That confidence, as we will see, was not entirely wrong either. The tragedy of Cunaxa is that both sides had accurate pictures of their own strengths and near-fatal blind spots about what the other side could do. As the army drew within a few days' march of Babylon, the tension changed quality. It was no longer the dull, grinding anxiety of the unknown. It was the sharp, clarifying fear of the near. The men could feel it in the air, the kind of collective bodily knowledge that large groups of soldiers develop before a major engagement, something that communicates itself not through words or briefings, but through the tightening of jawlines and the way conversations at the campfire get shorter and quieter as the days go on. Cyrus drilled his troops. He reviewed the Greek formation personally, riding his horse along the line with the careful appraising eye of a man who understood that these men, this phalanx, this locked wall of bronze and muscle, were his best card. His best card, in truth, was probably his only real card. It was in the days immediately preceding the battle that a Persian deserter came to Cyrus's camp and changed the entire tactical picture. The man reported that Artaxerxes intended to deploy his forces across the wide flat plain of Cunaxa, roughly 50 miles north of Babylon, using the open ground to maximize the effectiveness of his cavalry and his scythed chariots. He had a force that ancient sources variously estimate at somewhere between 300,000 and 900,000 men, figures that historians today rightly treat with enormous skepticism, but which even when reduced to their most realistic estimates still represent an army dramatically larger than anything Cyrus could field. The Greek contingent was Cyrus's best infantry. He needed them at the centre, facing the king's own position. He asked Clearchus to move the Greek phalanx to the centre of the line. Clearchus refused. It is one of the most consequential decisions in the entire campaign, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Clearchus's reason was tactical. He was worried about exposing the Greek right flank if the phalanx moved to the centre, leaving the river on the left and nothing but open desert on the right where Persian cavalry could roll around them. His instinct was classically Greek, classically Spartan, born from a lifetime of experience with a particular kind of warfare that had very specific rules about how flanks worked and what happened when they were left uncovered. He refused to move. He kept the Greeks on the right wing of the rebel line, with the Euphrates River protecting his own right flank, facing whatever Persian forces would be opposite them. What this meant in practical terms was that when the battle began, the Greek phalanx and the portion of the Persian royal army directly across from them would be offset. The Greeks would not be facing Artaxerxes' position. Artaxerxes would be facing Cyrus's Persian troops in the centre. And Cyrus, brilliant, headstrong, burning with a rage toward his brother that had been building for 4 years since that coronation ceremony at Pasargadae, would be in the middle of the line, separated from the only infantry force on the field that could reliably protect him. The stage was set, the armies were in position. The flat, baked earth of Cunaxa shimmered in the September heat. The battle was about to begin. Actually, before we get to the blood and the chaos of Cunaxa itself, and trust me, you do not want to be interrupted mid-battle, I want to take 30 seconds to thank the sponsor that makes this channel possible, NordVPN. Here is the thing. I spend a serious amount of time doing historical research, accessing academic databases, primary source archives, regional library systems across different countries, materials that are sometimes geo-blocked or restricted based on where you're browsing from. NordVPN solves that problem instantly. One click, and I can connect through servers in over 110 countries, access whatever resource I need, and do it with military-grade encryption protecting my connection the entire time. It is fast, it is clean, and honestly, after using it for a year on this channel, I cannot imagine doing this research work without it. And for you, whether you're watching this in Europe, Asia, North America, wherever, it means secure browsing, no tracking, no data selling, and the freedom to access content from anywhere in the world. Go to NordVPN and you get an exclusive discount plus 4 extra months free. That link is in the description. Now, back to 401 BC and the most brutal 50 minutes of anyone's afternoon. The morning of the battle began, as the worst mornings often do, with silence. The armies had been aware of each other for days. Persian scouts had tracked the rebel column as it moved south along the eastern bank of the Euphrates. Cyrus's own outriders had been reporting back the dust clouds and the movement of the royal forces gathering somewhere ahead, somewhere in the flat, shimmering infinity of the Mesopotamian plain. The men in the rebel camp knew it was close. They had known for days. That knowledge had done what knowledge of imminent violence always does to soldiers. It had condensed them inward, made them quieter and more deliberate, stripped away the small talk and the camp humour, and left something harder and more essential behind. Cyrus deployed his force with careful attention to the ground. The army formed near the Euphrates, with the river securing the extreme right flank of the rebel line, a natural barrier that prevented any flanking manoeuvre from that direction, and allowed Clearchus to anchor his rightmost men against the water's edge without needing to keep cavalry there. This was sound tactical thinking, and it was essentially Clearchus's demand. The Greek phalanx, some 10,000 to 13,000 heavy infantry strong, held the right. Clearchus commanded them personally. Proxenus of Boeotia was positioned to Clearchus's left, with his own contingent of Greek and allied troops. Cyrus himself held the centre with approximately 600 Persian cavalry, his personal household guard, his most trusted riders, men who would follow him anywhere, including, as it turned out, directly into a situation from which none of them would return intact. On the far left, Ariaeus commanded the bulk of the Persian and other allied Asiatic troops that formed the numerical backbone of the rebel force. Opposite them, Artaxerxes had arranged forces that made the rebel army look like a scouting party. The exact size of the royal army has been disputed by historians from antiquity to the present day, and the figures in ancient sources, Xenophon himself reports that deserters claimed a force of 900,000, are obviously inflated to the point of fantasy. Modern scholarly estimates, working from the logistics of supply and the physical constraints of deployment on a finite piece of ground, generally place the royal army somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 fighting men. Even at the lowest reasonable estimate, Artaxerxes outnumbered Cyrus substantially. His centre was anchored around 6,000 cavalry deployed around the king himself, forming a dense protective mass that was designed to keep Artaxerxes both mobile and shielded, while his numbers did their work on the flanks. On the royal left wing, facing the Greek phalanx across the shimmering open ground, Tissaphernes commanded a combined force of cavalry, light infantry, and the weapon that Artaxerxes apparently considered his most psychologically devastating trump card against the hoplites. Artaxerxes was reported to have 200 scythed chariots in his army, though Xenophon says only roughly 150 were actually present at the battle, the rest having arrived too late with the general Abracomas. Let us talk about those chariots for a moment, because they matter, and because the story of what happened to them is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the entire battle. The scythed chariot was the ancient equivalent of a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The design was genuinely brutal. Long horizontal blades projecting from the axles, sometimes angled forward, sometimes also mounted on the pole, designed to tear through packed infantry formations at speed and create cascading casualties that would break a unit's cohesion before it ever reached hand-to-hand range. Against troops who had never seen them, they could produce something close to panic. Against troops who had never trained to deal with them, even a small number could be catastrophically effective. His calculation was presumably that the sight and sound of scythed chariots accelerating toward you at speed was going to do things to Greek discipline that Persian infantry alone could not. He had not met Clearchus's men. The Greek phalanx, when the chariots came, did something that required a level of collective discipline that most ancient armies simply did not possess. They did not break. They did not run. They parted on command, and the training required to execute this on command, under the approaching thunder of horses and blades, is almost impossible to overstate. The hoplites opened deliberate lanes in their formation, gaps wide enough to let the chariots pass through harmlessly, and then closed again behind them. The chariots that entered those gaps found themselves in empty air with no one to kill, their momentum carrying them through and past the formation and into the open ground behind. The charioteers suddenly in the middle of enemy territory with no infantry support, and the Greek phalanx now behind them rather than in front, either attempted to turn, a cumbersome manoeuvre with a scythed chariot, or simply ran. The Greek light infantry and support troops behind the main line dealt with them efficiently and without particular drama. Every one of those scythed chariots had been completely neutralized in the space of a few minutes by men who simply refused to be impressed by them. Honestly, this is the moment where I genuinely love these men, because that takes something beyond skill. It takes a specific quality of nerve, a cold, almost contemptuous refusal to be frightened by the thing that is supposed to frighten you, that is genuinely rare in any army in any era. These were mercenaries, remember, men who fought for money, and they stood there while chariots with blades on the wheels came at them and calmly made a hole and let them through. That is not bravery in the romantic sense. That is trained, deliberate, absolute professionalism, and it is magnificent. The chariots having failed, the main battle lines engaged across the plain. Clearchus did not wait for the Persians to come to him. This was characteristic. The man did not have a defensive bone in his body, and the Greek way of war was almost congenitally offensive. He ordered the advance at a steady walk. Then, as the two lines closed to within shouting distance and the instinct for coordination through noise kicked in, the Greeks began the paean, the battle hymn, that rolling, rhythmic, almost hypnotic collective shout that Greek armies used to synchronize their nerves and their footsteps in the final seconds before collision. The Persians opposite them, by contrast, came on quietly. Xenophon specifically notes this. The Persian infantry advanced in near silence, which he found more unnerving in some ways than noise, an eerie, deliberate approach that suggested the presence of officers with enough control over their men to maintain silence under pressure. Then the Greeks broke into a run. The last 100 meters of a phalanx advance is not a sprint. It is a controlled acceleration, a managed surge that keeps the formation tight while adding the weight of momentum to the collision. 8 ranks deep, spears levelled, shields locked, the Greek phalanx hit the Persian left wing like a moving wall of bronze. What happened next was not prolonged. It was not a grinding battle of attrition. The Persian infantry opposing Clearchus's men collapsed, not slowly, rapidly. The front rank broke under the initial shock, which communicated itself backward through the Persian formation with the devastating efficiency of mass panic in a packed crowd. Tissaphernes, commanding the royal left-wing cavalry, apparently managed to avoid the worst of the collision by swinging his horsemen wide, looping around the Greek flank, avoiding contact with the phalanx entirely, and riding in the direction of the rebel camp in what some ancient sources interpret as a tactical maneuver, and others interpret as straightforward flight. Either way, he was no longer on that part of the battlefield. Clearchus and his men were advancing, pursuing the broken Persian left, watching their enemies scatter into the dust ahead of them. From their perspective, the battle was over. They had done their job. The Persian line on their sector had shattered and run. The ground was theirs. Some of the men may already have been calculating their bonus. They had absolutely no idea what was happening 400 meters to their left. Because while the Greek phalanx had been annihilating the Persian left, the center of the battlefield had descended into a completely different kind of chaos. Artaxerxes' force in the center was large enough that even with his left collapsing, his line still extended past the rebel left flank. Ariaeus and the Asiatic troops on Cyrus's left were already under pressure from Persian forces that simply stretched further than they could match. The rebel line was being outflanked on the left at the same moment it was winning on the right. It was the classic nightmare of ancient battle, winning in one place and losing in another, faster than any single commander could see and respond to the whole picture. Cyrus saw it. From the center, riding with his 600 household cavalry, he had a view of the field that gave him information no one else had. He could see the Greek phalanx advancing and winning, he could see his left beginning to buckle, and he could see directly ahead of him in the royal center something that made every calculation of military logic disintegrate in an instant. He could see Artaxerxes, his brother, the man who had taken what was his, the man who had sat on the throne that Parysatis had wanted for her favourite son, the man whose coronation ceremony had humiliated him, whose arrest order had nearly ended his life, whose existence was the single obstacle between Cyrus and everything he believed he deserved. He was right there, not behind a wall of infantry, not hidden in a command tent. There, visible, mounted, surrounded by his cavalry but identifiable. Close enough that a determined charge by 600 horsemen could reach him before his guards could fully respond. Cyrus did not deliberate. There is no evidence of a long strategic consideration or a careful weighing of options. He looked at his brother, and he charged. He pushed through his own forces and drove his 600 cavalry directly at the royal centre, at Artaxerxes himself. The charge was desperate, brilliant, reckless, and for one brief, staggering moment it almost worked. Cyrus broke through the outer ring of the royal guard. He drove his spear into his brother, piercing Artaxerxes through the breastplate and wounding him in the chest. A wound serious enough that, according to Theseus, who was there as the royal physician, the king fell from his horse and had to be helped to a small hill nearby. Some of the soldiers around the king, seeing him fall, reportedly shouted that Cyrus was the new king. The battle hung on a razor's edge, suspended in that terrible moment between everything and nothing. Then something small happened. A javelin. One javelin, thrown by a soldier whose name the sources give as Mithridates, a young Persian in the royal force. It struck Cyrus near the eye at the temple, all the more devastating because Xenophon records that Cyrus had gone into battle with his head entirely unprotected. Plutarch says he fell, struck his wounded head against a stone, and died. The Encyclopaedia Iranica, drawing on all the available source traditions, is direct. He was struck in the temple and killed instantly. His bodyguard, suddenly horsemen without a prince, scattered or died around him. The 600 became a rout. Cyrus the Younger, barely 23 years old, the most charismatic Persian prince of his generation, the man who had built a rebellion on borrowed money and borrowed soldiers, and the absolute certainty that he was born to rule, died in the dust of Cunaxa with a javelin in his head, 50 miles from Babylon, having nearly killed the brother he hated with his own hands. The rebellion was over. Artaxerxes had survived. The empire held, and on the right wing of the battlefield, Clearchus's men were still advancing, still chasing Persian soldiers across the plain, still celebrating a victory that had already become completely meaningless in the time it took a single javelin to fly 20 feet. To me, this is the hinge on which the entire story turns. Everything before this moment, the years of conspiracy, the recruitment of the 10,000, the 1,500-mile march, the tactical genius of the chariots and the phalanx advance, all of it points toward this single irreversible second. One man's rage, one javelin, and suddenly 10,000 of the finest soldiers in the world are stranded in the middle of an empire that has just confirmed its king and has every reason to want them gone, permanently. When the Greeks returned from their pursuit, still flushed with the uncomplicated joy of having just routed an army, they found the rebel camp plundered. Ariaeus's men had already fled. The Persian allied forces were gone, dissolving back into the desert. And at some point in those early evening hours, as the September sun dropped toward the horizon and the flat plain of Cunaxa cooled and the dust settled enough to see clearly, word reached Clearchus, word reached the captains, word reached every man in the Greek phalanx. Cyrus was dead. And the silence that followed that news was the sound of 10,000 men realizing all at once that they were completely, catastrophically, irreversibly alone. Grief when it hits an army does not look like grief. It looks like paralysis. The morning after Cunaxa, the 10,000 woke up, and the world had a completely different texture than it had 24 hours before. Everything they had assumed about their situation, the prince who paid them, the rebellion that gave their presence here a purpose, the chain of command that connected their daily existence to some larger strategic objective, was gone. The baggage train had been ransacked in the chaos of the previous day's fighting, which meant food stores were compromised. Ariaeus and the Asiatic troops who had made up the bulk of Cyrus's army had fled in the night, pulling back to a position further north, and sent a message saying they would not stay where they were and that the Greeks should come to them quickly if they wanted any Persian allies at all. The rebel cause, which had taken 4 years and the better part of a treasury to build, had dissolved in less than 12 hours. Clearchus, in the immediate aftermath, did what Clearchus always did. He organized, he assessed, he made decisions. He sent riders to Ariaeus with a blunt message. The Greeks had won their battle and they still had an army, and they were still willing to fight, and they needed to know immediately whether Ariaeus would renew the campaign. Ariaeus replied, just as bluntly, that without Cyrus there was no campaign. The surviving Persian troops would not march against the king under any other banner. The cause was dead. The only question now was survival. The Greeks sent their own emissaries to the royal camp. This required a particular kind of courage that does not always get acknowledged. Walking into the territory of an empire whose king you had just spent several months trying to overthrow, carrying a message that amounted to, "We were only following orders." The message they carried was essentially a request for safe conduct. The Greeks had been mercenaries under contract to Cyrus, they had played no part in the political conspiracy, they wanted to go home, and they would like assurances that this was going to be possible without the royal army hunting them all the way to the Black Sea. Artaxerxes did not respond immediately, and into that silence walked Tissaphernes. There is a particular kind of dangerous intelligence in the world, the kind that is always 3 moves ahead, that processes situations not in terms of what is happening, but in terms of what can be extracted from what is happening. Tissaphernes had that quality in full measure. He was the satrap of Lydia and Caria, one of the most powerful provincial governors in the empire, and he had a history with Cyrus the Younger that went all the way back to the moment of Artaxerxes' coronation, when he had been the one to whisper the accusation that nearly got Cyrus killed. He was not a man with clean hands in any of this. He had hated Cyrus with a focused, professional intensity, and he had been rewarded for that hatred by watching Cyrus die in the dirt at Cunaxa, while he himself survived and stood in good favour with a grateful king. Now he looked at 10,000 Greek hoplites stranded in the middle of Mesopotamia and saw something that a less calculating mind would have missed entirely. He saw an asset, not a military threat, not a problem to be solved by destroying them in the field. though the ancient sources make clear that Artaxerxes had advisors who suggested exactly that. Destroy the Greeks now, while they are disorganized and leaderless, before they have time to recover their discipline. Tissaphernes argued against this. His argument, as reconstructed from Xenophon's account and from the later behaviour of the king, was essentially political. Destroying the 10,000 by force was not guaranteed. Greek hoplites, even leaderless and exhausted, were the most dangerous infantry on earth, and chasing them across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain toward their own territory, while they fought a running retreat, was not a risk-free exercise. Tissaphernes had seen what they did to the Persian left at Cunaxa. He was not interested in sending Persian troops into a grinder. What he proposed instead was subtler and, in its way, far more brutal. Negotiate, offer safe conduct, build trust incrementally, and then, at precisely the right moment, cut the head off. He approached Clearchus personally. The approach was masterful. Tissaphernes presented himself not as an enemy, but as a friend, a Greek speaker of significant sophistication, a man who had spent decades dealing with Greek mercenaries and Greek city-states, and who understood how to read a Greek soldier's psychology. He told Clearchus that he admired the Greeks, that he wanted to help them return home, that he could intercede with the king on their behalf and arrange a safe escort north through the empire. He told Clearchus that there were others at court who wanted the Greeks dead, but that he, Tissaphernes, was working to protect them. He made himself, in other words, appear to be the one man standing between the 10,000 and catastrophe. And Clearchus, the iron-souled Spartan who had never been fooled by anyone, who had survived more political traps than most men his age had eaten dinners, believed him, or at least chose to act as though he did. This is the part that I keep returning to every time I read the Anabasis, and I cannot fully explain it. Clearchus was not a naive man. He was not a trusting man by any natural inclination. He had spent his entire career in an environment where betrayal was a standard operating procedure, and where extending trust to anyone outside your immediate circle of proven loyalty was an invitation to disaster. And yet here, in the most dangerous situation of his life, surrounded by enemies, without a patron, without resources, on enemy soil, here is where he dropped his guard. Proxenus of Boeotia, the younger commander who was closer to Xenophon and who had a more diplomatic, open temperament than Clearchus, actively encouraged accepting Tissaphernes' invitation. Proxenus genuinely believed the offer was sincere, and Clearchus, perhaps because he had no better option, perhaps because the mathematics of the situation made negotiation appear more survivable than open hostility, agreed. The invitation was for a formal meeting, a summit, in modern terms, to be held at Tissaphernes' camp. The ostensible purpose was to discuss the terms of the Greek withdrawal and the route they would take north. The senior Greek commanders would attend. They would come in good faith. They would work out the details of a peaceful solution. Tissaphernes gave his word as a Persian nobleman and a representative of the king that the meeting would be conducted honourably. He swore by his gods and the sacred fire that the Greeks would not be harmed. The day of the meeting, Clearchus led the delegation across the open ground between the two camps. He took with him 4 other generals, Proxenus, Menon of Thessaly, Agaius the Arcadian, and Socrates the Achaean, and approximately 20 captains, the mid-level officers who formed the operational backbone of the Greek force. He left the main body of the 10,000 in their camp. He probably told them to wait and he would be back by evening. He was never coming back. The moment the generals crossed into Tissaphernes' camp and entered the large tent prepared for the meeting, the trap closed. The Greek captains who had entered with the generals were cut down immediately by Persian soldiers waiting inside. Not captured, not arrested, killed on the spot. The 5 generals were seized and bound. From outside the tent there were shouts and the sounds of a brief violent struggle as some of the Greek soldiers who had been waiting outside the perimeter realized something had gone wrong and tried to fight their way in. They failed. The Persians had numbers and preparation on their side. A general and junior officer named Clearchus of Arcadia managed to escape in the chaos, wounded, and ran back to the Greek camp with the news. The reaction in the Greek camp was the closest thing to genuine collective despair that the Anabasis records. Xenophon describes men falling to the ground where they stood, men weeping, the specific terrible silence of thousands of soldiers who have just been told that everything protecting them from annihilation has been removed in a single afternoon. Because it was not merely the loss of 5 commanders, as devastating as that was in purely military terms, it was what the act meant. It meant that Tissaphernes had never been offering safety. It meant every assurance they had received since Cunaxa was a carefully constructed fiction. It meant they were not prisoners awaiting negotiation. They were targets awaiting elimination, and the only reason they were still alive was that their enemies had not yet decided on the most convenient method. Clearchus and the 4 captured generals were transported north under heavy guard, bound and in chains, to the court of Artaxerxes II. There, the king issued the order that the ancient sources record with the cold brevity of official business. They were beheaded. 4 generals who had marched 1,500 miles on the word of a prince, who had smashed the most powerful empire on Earth's left wing in open battle, who had survived the burning desert and the Euphrates crossing and the grinding weeks of uncertainty after Cunaxa. They died on their knees in a Persian courtyard, not in battle, but as victims of a dinner invitation. Menon of Thessaly alone was spared execution, held for months before being tortured to death, according to Xenophon, who had his own deeply personal reasons for despising Menon and whose account of that man's end should be read with awareness of the author's bias. Now consider what Tissaphernes had just created. 10,000 professional Greek soldiers, the finest infantry in the world, were now in the middle of the Persian Empire without senior commanders, reliable allies, supply lines, or political leverage, surrounded by a power that had just shown it would violate the sacred protection of guests without hesitation. They were 1,500 miles from the Aegean coast. Between them and friendly territory lay the Tigris River, the mountains of Kurdistan, the Armenian highlands, hostile tribes at every turn, and the Mesopotamian winter building on the horizon. Tissaphernes had given them a horse, an ox cart, and a road going north, and told them he would escort them home, and every single man in that camp understood that his escort was a hunting party, waiting for the right moment to close the ring. The 5 great generals were gone. The experienced officers who had kept the operational engine of the army functioning were dead or scattered. The captains who remained were capable men in many cases, but not experienced strategic commanders. The army needed leadership, and it needed it not in a week or a month when someone had time to prove himself through gradual ascent. It needed it the morning after the generals died, because an army without direction in hostile territory begins to dissolve within days, not from enemy action but from the inside, from the cascading psychology of hopelessness that sets in when men cannot see a path forward. Tissaphernes, for all his intelligence, had made one calculation wrong. He had assumed the Greeks would break. He had looked at their situation, leaderless, stranded, outnumbered, exhausted, thousands of miles from home, and concluded that despair would do his work for him, that they would surrender or fragment into manageable pieces, or simply stop being a coherent military force and become instead a scattered collection of desperate individuals whom the empire could deal with piecemeal. He had not accounted for a roughly 30-year-old Athenian gentleman scholar with no formal military rank, no official command, and no experience leading anything larger than a dinner conversation. He had not accounted for Xenophon. Here is where the story bends towards something that is almost impossible to believe if you encountered it as fiction. Xenophon of Athens was not a soldier, not by training, not by profession, not by the social category his world placed him in. He was an educated Athenian of good family, a student of Socrates, yes, that's Socrates, who had come on this expedition as a private citizen at the invitation of his friend Proxenus, presumably expecting adventure, and perhaps material for the kind of philosophical reflections on war and leadership that educated Greeks of his generation liked to collect. He had no command. He carried no official weight. When the generals died, he was nobody in particular. One more Greek among 10,000 in the camp, grieving the loss of the men who had brought him here, and the friend who had invited him. He says in the Anabasis that he had a dream. The night after the news of the generals' deaths arrived, he dreamed that his father's house was struck by lightning, and all the rooms blazed with light. He woke up and decided this was either a sign of divine illumination or a warning of catastrophe, and he lay there in the dark, turning the options over in his mind with the methodical, philosophical precision of a man trained by the greatest teacher of his age. He concluded that doing nothing was certain death. He got up, called the surviving junior officers together, and told them, with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, exactly what was going to happen to them if they did not act immediately and elect new leadership. He was right. They knew he was right. And so began one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of human endurance. The 10,000, under the emergency leadership of Xenophon and several other elected generals, including the Spartan Cyrus, began their march north, not as a defeated force slouching toward destruction, but as a functioning, disciplined army that had simply changed its objective from conquest to survival. They marched through the mountains of Kurdistan in the depths of winter, through snow that came to the soldiers' chests in places, fighting off tribal attacks from the Cadutian highlanders who gave them no rest and no mercy for days at a time. They crossed the Tigris. They crossed the Euphrates again. They climbed into the Armenian highlands where the cold killed men who lay down to sleep and simply did not get up in the morning. They fought the Persians, fought the local tribes, fought the landscape, fought disease and hunger and the slow, grinding erosion of morale that comes from weeks without warmth or safety or any clear end in sight. And then, roughly 4 months after Cunaxa, in the early spring of 400 BC, the army crested a ridge somewhere near the southern shore of the Black Sea, and the soldiers in the vanguard began to shout. The shouts spread back through the column like fire through dry grass, man to man, rank to rank, until the whole army was roaring it, the latter, the sea, the Greek sea, the way home. Xenophon, riding toward the sound, found his men weeping and laughing simultaneously, building cairns of stones on the ridge and embracing each other with the violent, desperate relief of people who had genuinely not known, some mornings, whether they would survive to see this view. 10,000 men had marched into the heart of the greatest empire on earth. They had won their battle and lost their war in the same afternoon. They had been betrayed, decapitated, left for dead in a desert, hunted across a continent and hammered by everything the ancient world had to throw at them. Roughly 6,000 of them made it to the Black Sea. Fewer still would eventually reach Greek territory, but they made it. The 10,000 made it home, and the story they carried with them, the story that Xenophon wrote down in the Anabasis and left to every generation that came after, changed the ancient world in ways that no one fully understood until decades later. Because what the March of the 10,000 demonstrated, with brutal, undeniable clarity, was that the Persian Empire, the largest, most powerful, most feared political entity on earth, could not destroy 10,000 determined Greek soldiers even when they were leaderless and stranded in its heartland. If 10,000 could survive that, a reader of the Anabasis might ask, what could 100,000 do? What could a united Greek force under a single gifted commander accomplish? Later Greek readers saw the Anabasis as living proof that Persia could be penetrated from the inside. Whether or not Alexander personally carried it as a field guide, he crossed into Asia 60 years after Cunaxa and answered the question Xenophon's story left hanging. Tissaphernes, for what it is worth, did not live to see any of this. He overreached in the years after Cunaxa, made enemies at court, lost battles to the Spartans, and was lured to a meeting in the city of Colossae in 395 BC. He arrived. He was arrested in his bath. He was beheaded. Parysatis, the queen mother, the iron-souled woman who had loved Cyrus above all things, had finally called in enough favours with the king to arrange it. She had her revenge. She then reportedly had Tissaphernes' head brought to her and gloated over it with the focused, unhurried satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting 4 years. You do not cross the queen mother of Persia, even when you win. And so the story of Cunaxa ends not with a victory parade or a clean moral lesson, but with what history usually ends with, a complicated mess of grief and consequence and survival. Cyrus is dead in the dust of the plain. Clearchus is dead in a Persian courtyard. 5 generals who were promised safety are in the ground. The 10,000 men who trusted them are scattered between the Black Sea coast and the pages of a book that a young Athenian who probably should have stayed home wrote because he could not think of anything else to do with what he had seen. The world was never quite the same again. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely thank you. This is the kind of story that I believe deserves to be told properly, without shortcuts, without the sanitized version where the famous name wins and everyone goes home happy. The real history is messier and darker, and so much more human than the legend, and that is exactly why it matters. If this video gave you something, a new perspective on these men, a reason to pick up the Anabasis and read it for yourself, or just more than an hour of the kind of history that you do not always find on a screen, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next one, because this story of the Greeks and the Persian Empire is nowhere near finished. We have Agesilaus and Tissaphernes' downfall, the rise of the Spartan hegemony, the revenge campaigns in Asia Minor. All of it is coming. Share this video with someone who loves history and does not know this story yet, because they absolutely should. Drop a comment below telling me which part of this story hit you hardest, whether it was Cyrus's death, the general's betrayal, or that moment on the ridge when the men first saw the sea. I will see you in the next one. The history is waiting.